Welcome to the Authority File, the academic library podcast from Choice. Choice is a publishing division of the ACRL and the publisher of Choice Reviews, Resources for College Libraries, and CC Advisor. This episode is brought to you by Taylor and Francis. I'm Bill Mickey, the host of the podcast and the editorial director at Choice, and this series debuts a new format for us here at the Authority File, where we're pairing up a Choice reviewer with an OAT award-winning author or editor. So we're pleased to welcome our special guest host, Dr. Randy Cornelius, professor of psychological science at Vassar College and one of Choice Review's longest-running reviewers. Dr. Cornelius has been reviewing with Choice since 1988. OATs, short for Outstanding Academic Titles, are an annual list of the best academic titles reviewed by Choice. The 2018 list is just out and available in our January issue and online at choicereviews.org. For more information about the Outstanding Academic Titles franchise, visit choice360.org. So, in this series, Dr. Cornelius interviews Dr. Heidi Maibom, professor of philosophy at the University of Cincinnati and the editor of the Routledge Handbook of Philosophy of Empathy, which he awarded an essential rating, calling the handbook an important addition to any philosophy and psychology collection. This wide-ranging discussion mirrors the book's diverse set of topics about empathy and sits at the intersection of philosophy and psychology. Doctors Cornelius and Maibom talk about the differences between cognitive and affective empathy, whether empathy can be considered an emotion, its relationship to altruism, and whether there is currently an empathy deficit in the United States. In this episode, Dr. Cornelius and Dr. Maibom continue their cross-disciplinary discussion of empathy, how empathy, compassion, and moral decision-making are related, what psychopaths can teach us about empathy, and whether we currently have an empathy deficit in the United States.
So let me, since we're running into our time here, let me ask you about something that is something that is, well, I'm sorry to pause here, but I'm thinking about it a little bit, and that about how to say it. Something that could be seen as creating a boundary between humans and other animals, and that is our ability to engage in moral decision making. To what extent is empathy, and in your book, there's some discussion of empathy and the cultivation of compassion. How are empathy, the cultivation of compassion, and moral decision making related? I know that's a whole book right there. But
Well, I mean, I think that one important aspect that I'm thinking about right now is the understanding that empathy gives of another person's plight and their situation. So a bunch of people in moral psychology, including one of my graduate students, is working on this idea that what empathy does is it helps us pay attention to morally relevant facts in the environment. Yeah, so it makes pain stand out, and suffering. And also this idea that you can think of empathy as a means by which we access important aspects of the world, namely the emotions of others. And insofar as emotions, if you go like, I mean, I like Lazarus's idea of emotion being a way of assessing the significance of the environment to your well-being, right?
yes,
So insofar as
right.
you're picking up on other people's emotions, you're actually picking up on that fact. And
Right.
I think at least a good part of morality is concerned with other people's well-being. I mean, we also have, philosophy of right
Mm-hmm.
and justice and distribution and stuff like that, which may be more tangentially related. But when it comes to
Right.
well-being and suffering and pain, it
Mm-hmm.
really does seem as if empathy is a way that our evolution has, in a certain sense, set us up to access an important part of the
Right.
world, namely other people's well-being.
Mm-hmm. And then that would seem to me to be prior to um, engaging in moral decision making, right? Then that might set in motion um, a set of cognition. They don't actually have to be conscious necessarily, uh, that have to do with us deciding what's right and wrong.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that basic sensitivity at the outset is, my bet is foundational. It's fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
Of
Mm-hmm.
course, I also think it's the kind of thing that you can get better or worse at, right? So, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
one thing that most parents do with their children, if they live in the country, is that they lie to them about the fact that they're eating the animal that was in the garden before that they really
Right.
liked, right?
Right.
And then when they get a little older, they just essentially teach them that the animals that we eat have no value other
Right.
than instrumental value to us. But
Right.
I don't think that's a natural approach for a lot of children, right? So in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
ways, we're being taught to be less empathetic, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and to be more directed with our empathy and so on. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity for development. And, it's not just people are very empathetic or not. We can make conscious decisions about what we do, right? And what kinds of capacities we want to nourish more in
Mm-hmm.
ourselves.
Mm-hmm. 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 That's a wonderful way of saying that. You've written about psychopaths. Um, does the existence of psychopaths tell us anything interesting about empathy?
Absolutely. I think it does. I think that one of the things that I've found really interesting is because the way that the research is being carried out there is very, very different from the empathy altruism literature, right? It's a very different
Mm-hmm.
design. And what you're finding out, and I think what you're really focusing more on in psychopaths is empathy proper as opposed to the empathy altruism literature, which is really more sympathy.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're really interested in this literature is, why do psychopaths not have the same response to pain and suffering in others that we do? Right? So you're
Mm-hmm.
specifically
Mm-hmm.
focusing on empathic distress.
Right.
And so what you find there is that empathic distress engages your entire defensive system, right? So it's a defensive reaction. The same kind of activation as when you're about to flee, etc., is what happens when you're exposed to somebody else in pain or distress. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
super interesting, and also a little bit in support of that idea that I said, that empathy evolved as a you know
Right.
for living in a group and being so. The threat to the other person is a threat to yourself. Now, what
Right.
turns out in psychopaths that's really interesting is they seem to have the initial orienting response,
Mm-hmm.
and then, whereas there's a continuation of activation and maybe a stepping up of activation in ordinary people, there's a suppression of that
Mm-hmm.
activity in psychopaths. But that activity is under conscious control, interestingly, right? Because you see
Mm-hmm.
it in doctors too when they get exposed to patients being injected and stuff like that, right?
Right.
So
Right.
experience and whatever can make you less sensitive in that later part of the response. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I think that teaches us a lot about when we're thinking about responsibility in psychopaths, we're thinking about possible treatments, but I also think
Mm-hmm.
this idea that that our response to others in distress really is something almost like a survival response. Those are
Mm-hmm.
the mechanisms
Mm-hmm.
that get engaged. I think that's super interesting, and I think that has implications for how we're going to think about it when we're thinking about moral theory too.
Mm-hmm. So would you um, disagree with Paul Bloom and Jesse Prince that empathy is not always a good thing. Have they somehow gotten the empathy psychopaths relationship wrong, or see that as too strong or reflected in everyone's empathic responses just because some people don't respond in the appropriate way?
Well, I mean, I think when it comes to psychopaths, I don't know that Bloom has anything to say about it.
No.
Jesse essentially just goes with sadness, right? He says they can't experience
Mm-hmm.
sadness and it's a sadness
Mm-hmm.
response. I mean, that's fine, but we have a lot of evidence on the on the side of that sort of empathic distress, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think that I myself have written papers about what the limits of empathy is and where it's more strongly engaged than others, right? I mean, you can't get all of our morality out of empathy because a lot of it has to do
Right.
with justice. And I think some justice
Right.
concerns really are much more tangentially related
Mm-hmm.
to empathy. However, I think that, Bloom's attitude seems to be something like this. Empathy is bad. Why? Well, because it's focused on the individual.
Mm-hmm.
It's also subject to time and space consideration. How far the person is away. All considerations, by the way, that both Hume and Smith were familiar with and answered.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea seems to be this: for empathy to be good, empathy has to do everything on its own, morally speaking. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
that's a crazy, like, I don't know anybody who has that view. I don't know anybody,
Right.
right? Of course, empathy is an important part of, and then you need to use reason too, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, of course, you need to
Mm-hmm.
reflect on things, etc. That's not a surprise. So I feel that Bloom a little bit has set up a straw man,
Mm-hmm.
and then demolish it, and that's fine, but it is a straw man. And if you
Mm-hmm.
think about it, right, there isn't anything in life that can't be used negatively, that can't have a negative
Mm-hmm.
side to it, right? I mean, take an emotion like fear. Fear, super important. You don't experience it, you're in trouble. But if you experience a lot of fear, now you also have problems, right?
Right.
Well,
Right.
empathic distress is similar, right? I mean, too much of a good thing, as they say, right? And
Right.
sometimes you need to be wise about where it's employed and so forth and so on, right? But
Mm-hmm.
as long as you do that, I think essentially you're fine, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a short version.
Well, I tend to agree with you. I always ask my students to think about the seven deadly sins and the opposite of gluttony, right? You have to eat,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
And if you let somebody walk all over you, that's not right,
Yeah.
right? But if you're enraged all the time, that's not right. So,
Right.
yeah. So I'm in agreement with you. So one final question here, and this is a very loaded question. In last week's New York Times, the dramatist James Graham, um, commenting on the Brexit situation in Britain, said that there's an empathy deficit in our politics. Do you think we have an empathy deficit in the United States? Do you see the cultivation of empathy playing a role in perhaps changing the current toxic political climate in our own country?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be very helpful. I mean, the way I mean, I'm reminded of the debate that ensued when Obama said that he wanted to appoint empathic judges, right?
Mhm.
And then people on the right became hysterical and they were like, oh, it's all about the bleeding heart, whatever. I mean, I don't really understand what the bleeding heart is, why that is um, so terrible. I mean, after all, this is supposed to be this great Christian country, and if somebody had a bleeding heart, it was Jesus of Nazareth. You know what I mean? So that's a bit puzzling to me, but we'll put that aside. I think that there is a epistemic element to empathy and to perspective taking, namely that it gives us understanding. And I think that was really what Obama was about when he talked about the judges. He said people who don't have any appreciation of the situation of the people that they're judging are not in a good position to judge them, right? That was what he was saying. He wasn't saying, oh, it's a nice guy who's just going to bend the law, which he was interpreted as. And I think that if we can look at empathy in that way, I mean, I think that there's the warm-heartedness of empathy I love too, don't get me wrong, but for those who somehow think that it's suspect to have warm feelings for other people, they might find it less suspect to understand other people and where they're coming from and why they're thinking what they're thinking and what their experience is like, right? And I mean, I think there is this great blindness, and I think it's an intentional blindness of people who are better off from seeing the kind of situation that a huge part, I mean, the United States now has got the biggest poor population probably in any Western industrialized nation. And this idea, oh, people can just pull themselves up by the bootstraps, relies, I think, on a fundamental failure to understand the situation that at least half, if not most, Americans are actually in, right? And now we're talking about the perspective-taking element, right? But I think that would be extremely useful. Now, of course, you can't just do it by, oh, I'm just going to imagine what it's like to be poor. You have to have information to help you. Does that make sense? You know, you can't just sort of pick it out of nowhere. But inform yourself and then try to think, well, what would it be like to be in that situation? And I think then this kind of idea, this weird sort of each person for themselves kind of idea, I think can really maybe be softened up a little bit, right? Because as someone like Immanuel Kant said, he said it is not rational to not want aid for yourself, right? Namely, everybody, ultimately speaking, would want to be helped by somebody else if they were in a certain situation, right? And opening up for those kinds of ideas, I think, is a way that perspective taking may very well make you do once it's balanced with good information about what people's situation actually is like as well.
You just heard a special Authority File podcast featuring our guest host, Dr. Randolph Cornelius, professor of psychological science at Vassar College, and a longtime choice reviewer interviewing Dr. Heidi Maibom, professor of philosophy at the University of Cincinnati and the editor of the Routledge Handbook of Philosophy of Empathy. Dr. Cornelius originally reviewed Dr. Maibom's book in the May 2018 issue of Choice, awarding it an essential rating. The book went on to be recognized by Choice as a 2018 Outstanding Academic Title. Find all of the episodes of The Authority File on your favorite podcast app or on our website, choice360.org. Just click on the librarianship dropdown. On choice360.org, you'll also find information on Choice's entire product platform, including Choice Reviews, CC Advisor, Choice webinars, resources for college libraries, our white papers, and a whole lot more. A great way to keep up with the Authority File is to join the Choice Authority File Facebook group, which you can access via the Choice Reviews Facebook page. As a member of the group, you can give us feedback, suggest podcast participants, chat with other listeners, and submit new topic ideas. Sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and the production and editing are done by Choice's digital media specialist, Mark Dirks. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.